Why do men even say it's not all men? How can they even say it's not all?
So I want to respond to this because you sound like you're genuinely trying to understand and explain where you're coming from. Here's some insight on why I think some of the girlies are getting upset in your comments over this topic. If I were to say not all white people, dedicating my time and effort to explain why I am not a threat and why I'm not bad and why their language, a group of oppressed people, hurts me, a privileged person, I'm essentially centering myself in their pain and distracting the general discourse from the more important issues. We can't make ourselves victims by making these suffering groups comfort us because we're having a hard time hearing about their pain and our part in it. If it's overwhelming and hurts to hear about, think about how overwhelming and hurtful it is to experience. Just as not every space is for me as a white person to take up, I think it's important for men to realize that they don't have to force themselves to be completely comfortable in these spaces where women are showing rage and grief and hurt at their oppression. Some of it might hurt your feelings, but honestly, scroll by. I say this with sincere compassion and as someone who has had to check my ego when listening to people of color. What's healing to these oppressed groups or how they are managing intense pain and suffering, whether it's executed perfectly or not, doesn't have to serve you in some way. You aren't obligated to get it or even like it, and that's okay. Don't force it to be your burden, you know? Here's another point that's incredibly important though. When people say, no, I am safe because I didn't commit a hate crime, I'm not a rapist, etc. This is setting up a false dichotomy that if you're not doing these really extreme, terrible deeds, then you're one of the good ones. This ignores that we all live under patriarchy, white supremacy, etc. And the small things we do on a daily basis, the microaggressions, the unconscious biases, etc., still have an impact. Our culture and the world around us is saturated with these things. To the person who did the microaggression, one instance of making a judgmental face or questioning the credibility of a person or whatever isn't going to seem like a monumental issue. But to the person of color or the woman who experienced these in almost every interaction with a white person or a man, you can't tell us it doesn't add up. If you don't experience our everyday lived experiences, you're going to be dangerously prone to saying these problems are too small, those don't count, and getting real caught up in the semantics and the details, then using it to discount our real suffering. Let's go back to the not all white people really quick. As a white person who grew up under systemic racism and white supremacy, declaring, not me, I'm safe, is not only unnecessary and distracting, but just wrong. I am not safe. I have biases that are so deeply ingrained I probably don't even know they exist, and they still affect my daily life. If I truly want to be a safe person, I have to be actively deconstructing and educating myself on Eurocentric beauty standards, laws, and cultural norms that affect people of color, listening to their experiences, considering how they haven't had almost any representation to hardly begin with, to share their stories. Who am I to say I understand the problem fully and solved it on my end when we are just out of slavery and just out of segregation and so on? Like, these things happened only a few generations ago, and then those white ancestors who engaged in those things taught us and taught me. There are still almost all white people in government. There are still primarily white main characters and white people in our media. Our cops and prison system is still flawed. There are still systemic issues we're trying to recover from and solve. It just sounds so silly to say that couldn't possibly influence me, and I'm free of this context. No, we don't live in a bubble. In fact, someone who thinks they're reformed and above the system and excused from it is probably more dangerous than someone who is just straight up dwelling in it, because these people who think they're reformed are not putting in any more work to make things better. This is why self-proclaimed allies and progressive people can still be a huge threat to oppressed groups. It's but a tiny step away from waiving all responsibility from yourself and trying to get people to prove their suffering and pain, which is incredibly dehumanizing for a group that's already suffering and oppressed so much. Bottom line is, I think if you think that you can be excused from a system of oppression, you don't quite understand how systems of oppression work. The not all men, not all white people, not all whatever is just taking a hyper-individualistic approach to systemic issues. I hope you can apply this thinking to patriarchy and how women are viewed and oppressed under our current systems and culture. Consider how many of our grandmothers were essentially still property because they couldn't have the financial freedom or education in the same way that men could. And then think about how men still run most of government and media. Those grandfathers, those people are the people who shaped our culture and taught us directly. These were the people writing our stories. These systems don't change overnight. This is not long ago. This is recent and relevant. Patriarchy is still coursing through every last one of our veins, just like racism. Anyways, I love your content, and I know it can be overwhelming being utterly swamped with upset comments and stitches of people disagreeing, so I hope this comes across as a genuine response to your question.